Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Microsoft Teams is the ultimate hub for teamwork and intelligent communications, and Microsoft Teams delivers chat-based collaboration, meetings, calling, and enterprise voice features. Developers can tap into the power of Microsoft Teams with Microsoft Graph to integrate your custom applications. And so in this module, you're going to learn how to use Microsoft Graph to interact with Microsoft Teams. Now in this first section, we're going to talk about why should you integrate with Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Graph's Teamwork endpoint, and protected APIs in Microsoft Teams. Let's start with why to integrate with Microsoft Teams. The first is to automate team lifecycles. You can use Microsoft Graph to create new virtual teams when a new business issue arises, add the right people to the team, and configure the team with channels, tabs, and apps. If you want to get the new team together to discuss a business issue, you can even add a new event to the team calendar. When the business issue is resolved and you no longer need to use the team, you can use the API to archive or delete the team. And if you know the maximum duration of the team when you create it, you can set a Microsoft 365 group policy expiration date for the team that automatically removes the team according to your policy. The next is to get work done even when no one is around. And you can use application permissions to work with teams, channels, and tabs without any intervention. You can create a new channel when your customer files an order, automatically create teams for classes at the beginning of the school year, and you can archive them at the end of the year. You can also create teams that are linked to your app and let customers create new teams and channels this way. You can install your Teams app to the new teams, pin your app to a tab in the new channel, and then send messages to the channel linking back to your website. You can also create and manage multiple teams and channels. Using Microsoft Graph, this makes it easy to create a large number of teams and populate them with users and channels by automating, creating, and managing teams, channels, tabs, and apps. Microsoft Graph also lets you find and archive the teams that you're no longer using. This is the same API that Microsoft Teams Admin Center and the Teams PowerShell commandlets are built upon. You can also deploy apps to Teams using this API. You can list the teams in your tenant and then install apps into them. You can also create tabs and channels to give users easy access to your apps. You can also use Microsoft Graph in any kind of an app. See, Microsoft Teams apps give work groups a new tool to make collaboration a more productive and compelling experience. These apps let work groups users share assets, interact through chat, and schedule events on the team calendar. And these apps can also automate creating teams, channels, and conversations, enhancing the value of Microsoft Teams. You can create websites, services, and native platform applications that run outside the Microsoft Teams user experience, and call the Teams API to automate team scenarios. These collaboration tools include Microsoft Graph-enabled tabs or bots running inside of Microsoft Teams apps. And you can also call Microsoft Graph outside of a Microsoft Teams app, such as from a website or a web service. If you've already enabled your website for Microsoft Graph, you can use that work for Microsoft Teams by using the Microsoft Teams developer platform to create a tab that uses the existing website code. And then finally, you can get notified about changes. Microsoft Teams supports subscribing to changes, create, update, and delete, to messages and channels, and chats to allow apps to get near instant updates. For details on how to subscribe to changes, you can see the change notifications messages in chats and channels. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes of data or more in the service that can add value for your users. Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud, as you can see from the list of resources, services, and entities on this slide. There are lots of things that you can take advantage of in the Office 365 platform. You can work with mail, calendar, contacts, tasks, in addition to content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, and interact with Microsoft Teams and many more things that you can take advantage of. Each of these services typically has its own API that you can leverage to read and write to these different services. However, it can be challenging and cumbersome to work with these different services as each has implemented their own endpoint, permission model, and syntax for performing some operations like searching and other subtleties. Each endpoint is also secured with Azure AD, which means that developers will need to authenticate with Azure AD and obtain an OAuth access token for each service they want to work with. The Microsoft Graph addresses many of these challenges by acting as a proxy to a lot of the different services. It encompasses data residing in Office 365, such as mail, calendar, and contacts, and OneDrive, as well as many others. In addition, it also provides access to Windows 10 and enterprise mobility and security under a single endpoint. This endpoint, https://graph.microsoft.com, allows developers to create applications that will only have to authenticate once and obtain a single access token that can be used to retrieve data from multiple sources, greatly simplifying the development process. Each service will still have their individual permissions or scopes, but all of these permissions are defined in a single place under the Microsoft Graph endpoint and handles the underlying calls and permission requests to each of these different endpoints. As the previous slide stated, the Microsoft Graph is your gateway to all data in Microsoft 365. It is a single resource that proxies multiple Microsoft services. Because the Microsoft Graph acts as a proxy endpoint to multiple endpoints for each Microsoft 365 service, it will simplify the process of obtaining OAuth access tokens that you must include with each request to one of these endpoints. Unlike the process of obtaining a different token for each endpoint, the Microsoft Graph enables you to obtain a single access token to submit requests that can retrieve data from all the services and endpoints that the Microsoft Graph exposes. One of the challenges we used to have to deal with these different services was determining the endpoint URL for each service, as some of them were unique to each user. To address this, Microsoft created a directory service that you could query to determine what the URL was for the different services for a particular user. However, the Microsoft Graph greatly simplified this with two special endpoints, the /me and the /myorganization endpoints. These will take you to the root of your user entity or your organization within the Microsoft Graph. This module will explain how you can easily find relationships between entities in the Microsoft Graph and traverse these objects to find related content. Using the /me and the /myorganization endpoints in combination with the ability to traverse related entities, the Microsoft Graph makes it easy to access your data. Developers can create all sorts of applications that will communicate with the Microsoft Graph. And to support as many developers and as many platforms as possible, the Microsoft Graph has two options for developers to choose from when integrating the Microsoft Graph into their applications. At its core, Microsoft Graph is a REST API. This means that developers can use any platform, any framework, and any programming language they are most comfortable with. The only requirement is that they issue a common HTTP request and process HTTP responses, which pretty much all relevant platforms and frameworks and languages can do these days. In addition, Microsoft Graph also provides native SDKs for developers who want to leverage a rich programming model with their applications. These SDKs are available for multiple platforms and simplify the process of interacting with the Microsoft Graph REST API, abstracting away the tasks of constructing, submitting, and processing the REST requests and responses with Microsoft Graph APIs. You will likely find an existing SDK for the platform and language that you are working on, as you'll find almost all of the popular platforms are covered, including .NET, iOS, Android, Java, PHP, Ruby, JavaScript, and many, many more. Microsoft Graph supports two styles of authentication. One supports the users to authenticate using either Azure AD accounts, which are also known as work and school accounts, or a Microsoft account. The former account is typically used to access content and resources within other Office 365 services in Microsoft 365. The latter account type, a Microsoft account, is used to access consumer services such as OneDrive Consumer, Outlook.com, and other related services. Now, what's nice about Microsoft Graph supporting both styles of authentication is that the same API and the same endpoints can be used to create applications that will expose business data to Microsoft in Microsoft 365 or consumer data within the Microsoft Consumer Services. Now, let's explore some of the things that you can do with Microsoft Graph's Teamwork endpoint, the way that you interact with Microsoft Teams with an API. So some of the things you can do is you can create teams, and you can use the Microsoft Teams API in Microsoft Graph to create teams in multiple ways. All teams are backed by Microsoft 365 groups, and this is the quickest way for you to get your team up and running when you create new teams with Microsoft Graph. And that is to set up a new Microsoft 365 group, all the owners and members, and then convert that group into a team. So when you're creating a new group that'll be converted to a team, you must do the following. You need to set a couple things like the group tabs, the group types to unified, the mail-enabled property to true, and the security-enabled property to false. You're going to create the group using the Microsoft Graph V1 Groups endpoint by submitting an HTTP post with the group's details. And you can see these here on this slide. Notice I've got the display name and the nickname set. I've got a description. But the most important ones that you see are the group types, the mail-enabled, and the security-enabled properties. Those are all set to those specific values that I just mentioned a moment ago. Now, furthermore, notice that I have the members and the owners section. So these are arrays, and these point to the fully qualified path to a specific user. The GUID that you see there at the end, that is the object ID of the user in your Azure AD tenant that your team is associated with. So here I've got two members that are tied to this group, and I have one owner that is also tied to this group. Now, this is the first step of creating a new team in Microsoft Teams. You're creating it as a Microsoft 365 group with an HTTP post, and you see that there on the top of the slide where I'm going to the v1.0/groups endpoint. The next step is to upgrade that group to a Microsoft team. And the way you do that is by submitting a post to the Teams endpoint, and then you're going to specify the group ID that you see there in the group at odata.bind property. I'm specifying the fully qualified path to the group that I want to update there. Now, I can also list all the teams in an organization or a tenant, and I can find all the groups that have teams and then get information for each one of the teams. I'm going to start by submitting a request for all the groups, and to get a list of all the groups in the organization that have teams, or to get a list of the groups and then code, I'm going to find the ones that I want. I can do that by using this first option that you see here. Now, just keep in mind that groups are large objects, so I may want to use that $select property as a query parameter to only get the properties in the group that I care about. And now notice that property on the end, the resource provisioning options. If that's set to true, what that is, that's going to be set to true, or that property is always going to be set whenever I have a group that has an associated team that's been assigned to it. So if I don't have that, then you can tell that I don't have a team. Now, if I want to get details on a specific team, I'm still going to go to the groups endpoint and then just specify the ID of the team by passing in just its ID. And then I also can get a list of all of the teams the current user has been joined or has joined by going to the /me/join teams endpoint. Now, the other thing we need to talk about are protected APIs. So some of the APIs related to Microsoft Teams are exposed by the Microsoft Graph. They may provide access to sensitive information. So Microsoft calls these things protected APIs, and they're going to require a little more validation beyond just typical permissions and consent that other APIs you may be familiar with require. In order for your app that's going to need to use one of these permissions or use one of these protected APIs, you're actually going to have to submit a request to Microsoft for review of your app. You can learn more about protected APIs, including the APIs which are included in this list, and the review process if you go review the Microsoft Graph documentation. There's an article that you see here I've linked on the slide that's called the Protected APIs in Microsoft Teams. You need to make sure you review that in order for this to make sure that this is going to work for you. Now let's take a look at a demo here. So in this exercise, or in this demo, what we're going to see is how to create a project using the Microsoft Teams toolkit for Visual Studio Code, and to configure some custom Microsoft Teams, configure the custom Microsoft Teams app with single sign-on to submit requests for Microsoft Graph. And we're going to use that throughout the other demos that we have in this module. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, in this demo, we're going to learn how to create a project using the Microsoft Teams toolkit for Visual Studio Code and configure the custom Microsoft Teams app with single sign-on to submit requests to Microsoft Graph. Now, there's a bunch of prerequisites for doing Teams development and Teams app development, and that includes having a Microsoft 365 tenant, making sure that Microsoft Teams is configured for development, and you have the necessary tools that are also installed in your environment. Now, this screencast is for a Microsoft Learning module that accompanies this screencast, and it actually has a hands-on lab exercise that's going to walk you through the exact same steps that I'm going to do here in this demo, as well as the other demos in this screencast. Now, if you want to see what the prerequisites are and you want to go through the list of all the installs, all of that stuff is referenced inside the exercise in the module. So I'd recommend you go take a look at that stuff. We're just going to go ahead and dive right into creating our app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start with creating the Microsoft Teams app project. And so to do this, I have to have something called the Microsoft Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio Code installed. And that I have installed right here on this Teams Toolkit tab that you see on the left-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to create a new app. And the very first thing it does is it's going to prompt me to sign in to my Microsoft account. This is going to be used to register the Teams app in both your Microsoft 365 tenants Teams App Store and in Azure Active Directory. So what I'm going to do is I clicked on allow, and then that's going to go ahead and have me sign in, or make sure that I'm checking that I'm already signed in to my environment, which you can see here in the browser behind me. I am already signed in as Megan, and I'm also signed in as Megan inside of Microsoft Teams. All right, so after signing in, the toolkit's going to prompt me to select the project that I want to create. So we're going to use Microsoft Graph, which requires all requests to include an OAuth 2 access token for authorization. So I'm going to create a new tab project using the single sign-on capability supported in Microsoft Teams. And I'm going to do that by choosing the TypeScript option for this last channel and group app with single sign-on. Now, on the configure project screen, I'm prompted for an app name and also prompted for the single sign-on domain name. So for my app name, I'm going to go ahead and change this to my MS Graph Playground. And then for the single sign-on domain, this needs to be a fully qualified domain that's going to serve up my custom app. It must be HTTPS, and it can't be localhost. Now, I can address these two requirements by using a tool called ngrok. It's a free tool. There's a paid version of it, but we just need the free version of it for this. And what it's going to do is create a secure routable URL to my local HTTP web server that the Teams Toolkit is going to create. So what I'm going to do is jump back over here to my command prompt. I'm going to type in ngrok, which I already have this installed, HTTP, and I want to expose localhost 3000. So now what this is going to do is this creates this routable URL, this dynamic subdomain routable URL. And when it creates that dynamic routable domain, it's going to, whenever a request goes to that domain, it's going to redirect it over to localhost. Now, with that being said, with this, the fact that I'm setting this up here, I'm going to go ahead and copy this out. If I ever stop ngrok and restart it, that subdomain is going to change. That's how the free version works. If you have a paid account, you can reserve specific subdomains so that the domain will not change. But just know that anywhere I'm using this domain, if I start and stop stop and start ngrok, it's going to change that dynamic subdomain. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in right here, and then I'm going to select register. So what this registration is going to do is it's going to go ahead and create my Azure AD application. It displays the Azure AD client app, the ID of the app, the ID URI, the redirect URI, the permissions that have been assigned to Microsoft Graph, and the secret. So I'm going to let this go ahead and finish. There's a registration updates here that's got one more step that's going to finish at the very end. But what I'm going to do is it's then going to prompt me for where I want to save my project. So we need to wait for that to come up. All right, so there we go. We've gone through, we've completed our project. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy all of this information here because I want to make sure that I have a good reference to it. Let's just grab it like this. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in a new file. So there we go. We got everything here. We got the secret and everything else. So I'm going to go ahead and select finish. And then it's going to ask me where do I want to put my project. So I'm going to put it right here inside of my play folder. So what it's doing now is it's creating the folders and files and scaffolding up my project. And I don't want to, oh, it got rid of that. That's okay. Let's see, we should still have it on our clipboard. Oh, don't close that. And yeah, we still have it on clipboard. Okay, good. So we're good. All right. So let's take a look at a few things here that were actually created in this project. In the .env file, what this file has is it's going to have our app registration. So there's that 14D1. And if I come back over here to what I copied down, we can see that that is our app. Okay, so that's good. We can see that that's already been set. Furthermore, we can also see that the base URL has also been set on our in ngrok as well. This is the fully qualified URL, including the protocol to the web server that's hosted by our app. In our case, that's going to be ngrok when I run it. Now, another thing we can take a look at here is let's just jump over to the Azure Active Directory portal. And I'm going to select, let's jump off app registrations and refresh it. We can see here's the app that was actually created. Okay, cool. So the next thing we want to look at is this app package folder. So this contains the team's app manifest file right here in manifest.json, as well as all the images that are going to be used by the custom app. So we see outline and color as well. It also creates our app package, this .zip file, and that's going to get regenerated every time we make a change to our manifest. It's going to do that for us. So one of the things I want to do is let's jump down here inside of Teams and let's look at this web application info. So this is going to contain some of the details about our Azure AD app that was created by the toolkit. This is what configures the Microsoft Teams SSO process with our application. So we've got this set up. We can see that it's got the ID set up and the resource. Let's take a minute and go take a look at the Azure AD application so we can see all the things that were configured here. So it's got a name that we can see. We have our graph, we have our Toolkit SSO MS Graph Playground. We can see our client ID. We have our directory ID as well. And we also have the application ID URI. Well, let's take a look at the authentication. So what we can see under authentication is we can see that the auth end endpoint on the web server that we're going to spin up locally when we run our project, that's been added as one of the redirect URIs for our project. Also notice the section on the implicit grant and hybrid flows. I have both types of tokens, the access tokens and ID tokens, already selected. And by default, it actually added our multi-tenant, or made our app a multi-tenant app as well. Now, if I come over here and look at the secrets, we can see our secret that starts with w.u. And if I jump back over to the summary of everything, we can see up when the Teams Toolkit added it, we can see that there's the secret as well that was displayed to us. So we've got our secret that's been set up here. That's what's going to be used to log in or to have our app connect to Azure AD and authenticate. Under the API permissions, we can see a handful of permissions that have already been assigned to the app. Just because we're in a developer environment, I'm going to go ahead and simplify the debugging story by going ahead and granting consent on behalf of all users in my tenant to this app. So they already have all these permissions that you're going to see by me granting consent. And what that's going to do now is that when my users go to use the app, they're not going to have to be prompted to go through the consent framework dialog. Last but not least, we have our expose an API. And what we can see here is we have our application ID URI has been set, and it also includes as part of it the domain where the app is going to be as redirecting to, or where the app is being hosted. You need to remember that all these places where you see that ngrok.io URL, because again, if I change if I change ngrok, if I stop this process that's running in the background, that subdomain is going to change. And so I'm going to have to go find all the places this is being used. I'm going to have to go update that. In our Azure AD app, that's really right here on the Expose API. And it's also going to be on the Authentication tab as well. That's pointing to the redirect URI. All right, so going back to the Expose an API, we've got our ID. We also have a scope that's been defined called Access as User. So we can see the full qualified path here. And then we also have taken that scope and we've automatically granted it to these two client applications. This is saying that these applications automatically trust, or Azure AD automatically trusts these applications. So don't prompt the user when the user is asking for the permission access as user, the scope that we just defined or we just looked at. One of these, the one that starts with 1F, that is the Microsoft Teams desktop and mobile client, whereas the second one here, the 5E3, is the web client. So now let's go build and test the application and make sure that this thing actually works. So I don't think we need any of this anymore. So we'll go ahead and close that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my command prompt, and I'm going to say, actually, let's do that over in our command prompt so we can still have the full window to work with. So I'll open up a new tab, and let's jump over here to our application. So that's in our play folder. There we go. We go into our playground. All right, cool. So now we're inside of our playground. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and say npm install, and that's going to go ahead and download all of the dependencies that our project needs in order to run, because this is a Node.js project. So I'm going to go ahead and let this finish, and we'll save the time and just skip ahead in the video and assume that this is completed. All right, once all the dependencies have been installed, as we see here, I'm going to go ahead and start up our app. So I'll say npm start. Now, we know that everything's going to be up and running once I see that it says our API server is running in the console. So let's just wait for this to finish. Oh, this is actually our web server. So actually we got two of these to do. I forgot about that. I also need to, let's go into our play folder, and I need to jump into the playground, and we need to go into our API server. So I'm going to do an npm install as well right there. So we'll go ahead and let this finish. Okay, so with this now we can see that everything has been installed. So I'm going to go ahead and say npm start. And here we can see we have an API server that's listening on port 5000. And in our other tab, I have our web server running on localhost 3000. So now we know that ngrok's going to be able to go get that. Now, why do I have two projects here? Well, the way that the project is set up here is this web project that's created that we ran at the root of our project. This is a Create React app. And so our app is running, our web server is actually running here on port 3000. The API server part of our project, which is what's running over here in this tab under the /API server, what that is doing is that's going to be used to go fetch an access token from Azure AD and also make calls to Microsoft Graph, or to go get the access token and exchange it, as we talked about in the slides, to be able to get data back from the Microsoft Graph. One of the things that you'll see here is that if I look at this package .json, one of the things we've done is we actually have a proxy that's running here in our project, and what that's doing is that is simplifying it's a capability of the Create React app, and what that does is says that any calls to 5000 on localhost 5000 are actually going to get redirected, or any calls to the proxy are automatically going to get redirected over to our API server. So that's how we're going to see those calls still work through our proxy. Okay. All right. So let's come over here and let's install our app. So I'm going to jump over here to Microsoft Teams and I'm going to go to this ... and I'm going to select more apps. And I'm going to come down here and select, I'm going to upload a custom app for me or my teams. And I'm going to find that manifest file of the app that I just created, which is inside of app package right here. Go ahead and say open. And here we go. This is the app that was created by, that we have running over here in VS Code. Once the app package has been uploaded, it's going to display a summary of it as you see here. I can also see like maybe some other stuff that needs to be done, like probably need to give it a better description and stuff, but that's not necessary for our demo. I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to add this to a team. And when prompted, I'm going to figure out a team where I want to add this. So we're just going to add this to our general channel right here, in our test team right there. So I have a test team that's already set up, and then I'm going to say, let's go set up the tab. Now in the tab configuration thing that's going to show up next, I'm just going to click save because I don't have any kind of configuration with this tab. So I'm just going to go ahead and say save. And here we go. So we can see we're getting Megan's information and we can tell it's working by calling Microsoft Graph because it's showing her profile image here on this tab. So what this is doing, what this sample is doing here is it's doing three things. The React app that implements the tab is successfully communicating with the host Microsoft Teams client that uses SSO to obtain an access token for the currently signed in user. The Create React app is also exchanging this access token for an access token. Well, the first one was really the bootstrap token, kind of, if you want to look at it that way, because that token, as we talked about during the lecture, is only good for obtaining the profile information, like an ID token. We need to go through and exchange that for a token that can be used for Microsoft Graph. So that can then be used, that we can use that next token to call Microsoft Graph. That process is being handled by our API server. And then finally, the React app is then using the access token that it got from the API server to submit a request to Microsoft Graph for the currently signed in user and grab their profile picture. So here we can see that everything is working. So why don't we go ahead and update the tab in Azure AD app to display a list of all the teams the current user has joined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave ngrok running, but I am going to come over here to our web project and our API project. I'm going to stop those, but I'm going to leave ngrok up and running. And I'm also going to make my life a little bit easier by just putting these in tabs. So I can see my web server up here and I can see my API server down here. So let's go back over here to Azure AD. And one of the things I need to do is I'm going to have to go in and add in a new permission. So I'm going to go to API permissions and I'm going to add a permission. It's going to be a Microsoft Graph permission and a delegated permission. And I want to add in the permission called team.readbasic.all. There we go. So let's get that permission and say add permissions. And then I'm going to go ahead and grant this permission as well, consent on behalf of all my users, just to simplify my life again. All right, now let's go back over to our code. And in the, let's go find our tab. So that's going to be under components. There's our tab right here. So I'm going to shrink up our API server. And what I'm going to do is inside of our Fluent UI React component, I'm going to go ahead and add in a new list component that we're going to use to display our lists. And then in the tab state, I'm going to come down here under photo and I'm going to add a new joined teams array of items. It's going to contain all of the teams that we get back. And then I'm also going to initialize that to an empty array. Freaking tight. There. Now, with the state of my component all configured, I'm now going to update the code to call Microsoft Graph. So I'm going to add this method. I'm going to create a new method here. And this new method, we're going to go ahead and put this one under the component did update. So let's find component did update. There it is right there. So we're going to put it right here. Right? It doesn't really matter where you put it as long as it's just a valid place to put it. So here I've gone ahead and I've added in this component did update method. And what this is going to do, or not component did update, I added this one, the users join teams. So what I've done here is I have a call to Microsoft Graph that I'm creating. So the endpoint we're going to is the me/join teams. I'm setting up the parameters to include my authorization details and the HTTP verb we want to use. I'm then going to submit the request by using the browser's fetch API. So I'm going to go ahead and go grab this endpoint and these parameters. And then when I get a response back, I'm going to go ahead and set the state, assuming there's no error that I had. I'm going to set the state to the join teams equal to the value property from the response. Okay. So what that does then, it's going to make when I call get users join teams, that's going to call Microsoft Graph, get an array of all the teams that I've joined, and it's going to assign that to my join teams array. Now, underneath in the component did update, let's go ahead and make a call for this so that once we get our graph call client, I'm going to say this.get users join team. So it immediately does that after it's all signed in. Now the next thing I want to do is we need to go through and render our changes out. So I'm going to come down here to our render method. And we can see where we're getting a reference to that avatar of Megan's picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the following code. Let's say let the joined teams equal this.state.joined teams.length. If this is greater than 0, then what I want to do, so make sure, did we get any joined teams back? And if we did, we're going to do something. If we didn't, I'm just going to say set the array, join teams array to nothing. So if we did, I'm going to say let's set the state of join teams. Let's look at that, go through and convert the data that we got. So every joined team. What I'm going to do with this, need to go with that and that, is I'm going to return back a new object. So I want to convert the object that I got from Microsoft Teams, and I'm going to convert it back to an object that's going to work to be bound to my list component. So I'm going to say key join team.id, and then I'm going to say header. No, that's not what we want. Header join team dot display name, and then the last one is the content, and that's just going to say the team ID is equal to join team.id, and there we go. So we should be good. All right, now the last thing I want to do is I want to go through and render this out. So right here underneath where my picture of my users being rendered, I'm going to come over here and add an H2 that says this user belongs to the following teams. There we go. And I will say list all the items equals join teams. Like that. So now it's going to render out my list of all of my users. So now what's going to happen? When the app runs, once it loads, it's going to go fetch all the joined teams from Microsoft Graph and set it on the state of our tab component. Because it's React, when you change the state, it's automatically going to call render again to re-render everything, which is going to go fetch all the teams in the state, and then it's going to bind them out or show them inside this list. So I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. Let's come back over here to my console, and I'll do an npm start and an npm start on both our web server and our API server. So the API server is running. We'll just wait for the web server to spin up. All right, both of them are running. So now I should be able to come back over to Teams, and let's go off the tab, and then we will reload the tab. And there we go. We can see all the teams that this person belongs to, and it's actually confirmed over here because we can see their teams over here inside of the Teams client. So great. So we're making a call to Microsoft Graph. We're getting the profile information of the current user, specifically their profile information, and then we are rendering out all of their teams. Now in this section, we're going to talk about how to configure a built-in tab with Microsoft Graph. Built-in Microsoft Teams tabs for websites or Office documents or SharePoint document libraries, as well as other tabs, can be configured using Microsoft Graph. So in this section, we're going to talk about how to configure an existing built-in tab with Microsoft Graph. So we're going to look at specifically a couple things. How do we create a custom tab in a Microsoft Team channel? We'll look at website tabs. We'll look at Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and PDF tabs, SharePoint document library, list, and page tabs, and then additional tabs as well. So to create or to configure a Microsoft Teams tab using the Microsoft Graph APIs, you need to know the Teams app ID of the app, and then you need to know a few more things like entity ID, the content URL, the remove URL, the website URL. Those are all the things that you're going to need to provide for that specific kind of an app. Now, some of these properties are going to be required for some tabs, while others won't be required, and it all depends on the tab that you're going to be creating. The Teams app ID is also seen as the ID of the property in the Teams apps manifest. So the way it works is that to create or to configure a tab, you're going to submit an HTTP post to the tab's endpoint. And this is going to be done on a channel with a payload that contains the settings to configure in the tab. And so here what you can see is I'm pointing to the Teams slash the ID of the team, which is also the group ID, slash channels, then the ID of the channel, and then to the slash tabs endpoint. Now this is going to include both the Microsoft Teams ID and the channel ID, and remember that the group ID is actually the team ID. There's another ID that we have for an actual team ID, but it's got that longer Skype-based ID inside of it. So here's what this code is going to look like here. So I haven't filled in a group ID or a channel ID. Those are placeholders that you see, but I'm submitting an HTTP post to the Teams endpoint, or specifically to the tabs endpoint, to create this tab. Now, if you look at the code here, notice the Teams app at odata.bind property. So that is what defines the Teams Microsoft Teams app that the tab is defined in. So again, let's just say that the Microsoft Word team has created a Microsoft Teams app that includes our tab. Well, that Teams app ID, that's the ID of that app. That's defined in the app's manifest. The configuration object is going to contain multiple properties. Again, as I said earlier, some of them are required, some of them may not be required, some of them shouldn't be used. It all just depends what the tab that we're creating, how that works, and how it's going to be how the tab loads content. Now, in this listing that you see here, this is an example Microsoft Word tab that's going to load the file sample.docx from a SharePoint document library. So I'm clearly definitely going to be updating a couple values here, both in the post at the top, the group ID and the channel ID. I'm also going to be updating the Teams app ID as well for the Word tab. We'll go through those in a minute. It's just a little too much to put on the slide right here. And then I'm also going to update the tenant as well for the URL of my SharePoint Online tenant. So let's look at some of these built-in tabs here. So some of the properties that we're going to use are, like I said, they are required, and some of them may not be required or are rarely used. So like, for example, the content URL property, that's used really in almost every tab. But some of them are rarely used, like the remove URL. So like, for example, when you're working with a Word tab, the remove URL and the website URL, those are supposed to be set to null. Those aren't ever really used. And the way that those are used is that if you specify the website URL, if the tab is not loading in, or if you're in a client that does not support the tab, there is usually a button where you can say, or an option where you can say, open this in a website. And that's the URL that they're going to be taken to, the one that says website URL. When you remove the tab from the channel, this is the URL that's going to pop up a dialog to show the page that the user should be displayed once they remove that URL. And the entity ID, that really depends, right? Sometimes it's used to reference a specific item, which can be it's usually going to be like a GUID. And the content URL, again, that's the content that should be displayed in the tab. So here again, this is our Word example, our Word tab example, and notice that entity ID and content URL, it may look like that's redundant, but you do actually need both of those values in your tab. So let's talk about different tab IDs. So these are all the supported tabs that we have that we can configure that are out of the box inside of Microsoft Teams. We've got a lot of the Microsoft Office types like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And you can see that their Teams app ID is some sort of a variation of com.microsoft.teamspace.tab.file.static.viewer. And then it's really the name of the actual app, or also, as you see there, it's also a PDF type as well, which is a well-known Office type. The website tab, that's just going to, this has got a name of itself of a .tab.web. A SharePoint document library. The SharePoint types are a little different. You've got a document library that is .tab.files.sharepoint. But if you're going to show a SharePoint list or a SharePoint page, you're actually going to specify that GUID that you see there on the slide. If you're working with Microsoft Stream, it's actually a com.microsoftstream.embed.skype Teams tab. Microsoft Forms and OneNote, again, we're switching back to the GUID style. There's no real reason why some are GUIDs and why some are strings. It just depends on what the different team had chosen. And then Planner and Power BI are the last two that we have that are out of the box. So let's talk about the configuration properties for these different tabs. Now, you'll notice the word null showing up a lot on here, and that's because the configuration object is not supported on the majority of these different tabs. But the first three, it is supported, and there's some things that we're going to need to set. So when you're working with an Office file type tab, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, or PDF, you're going to want to specify the URL of the underlying SharePoint document library, the file in that library. That's the full URL that you're going to want to use. Now, it's not just as simple as opening up the document or the spreadsheet or PowerPoint deck or the PDF and then grabbing the URL from the browser and just pasting it in. You need the URL needs to be the fully qualified URL down to the file that has the site slash or the tenant slash site slash folder or document library name slash subfolder and then slash file name. It needs to be in that kind of format. You also need the ID of the document. This is a GUID, and this is the actual ID of the document in the document library. I'll show you in the demo in just a minute how we can pull those values out of the URL when you go find that document. If you're going to be using a website and you want to have just the website tab to display a URL, you're going to leave the entity ID and the remove URL properties to null, but you're going to set the URL that you want to open as both the value for the website URL and the content URL. And when it comes to a SharePoint document library, you're going to want to set the entity ID to an empty string, and then the content URL is going to be the same kind of URL that you use for an Office file, except there's no file underneath it. After that, everything else is just null because all of these other tabs, they don't have a configuration object that they will support. So you want to leave all those values null. All right, so let's take a look at a demo here. So in this demo, we're going to add a few built-in tabs to a channel in Microsoft Teams with Microsoft Graph's Teamwork endpoint and using that Azure AD app that we created in the previous in the project that we created in the previous demo. All right, in this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to take the project that I created in the previous demo, and I'm going to extend it by giving it the ability to add a couple additional built-in tabs that we're going to have inside of Teams for some things that are already tabs that are already available to us out of the box in Microsoft Teams, like Word and Excel, etc. And I'm going to do this by creating a button that when I click it, it's going to go ahead and add in these other tabs using the Microsoft Graph API. So the first thing I need to do is I need to give my app some additional permissions to do this. So I'm going to go back, still logged in from the previous demo, to my API permissions on the Azure AD app that we're working with. And I'm going to go find the permission called Teams tab. It's a delegated permission in Microsoft Graph. So it is a Teams tab, and I want to be able to write for the team. So there we go. So Teams tab, write for the team. So I'll add that permission. And just like I've done before, just to simplify things, I'm gonna go ahead and grant admin consent right here to, so we don't have to go through the consent flow as we're demoing it. All right, now, before I go about doing this, I need to go add some files or make sure I have some files that are available in this team. So do we have a Word document and an Excel document? We absolutely do. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to leave those here. We're going to go ahead and use these as our apps here. Now, the thing that I'm going to have to do, though, is I'm going to have to grab the links for these and the IDs for these because I'm going to need these when I go create this tab. So you need to know the URL and the ID. So there's a couple ways to do this, but I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way. So I'm going to choose the document. I'm going to go ahead and say open it in SharePoint. So it's going to open it up in a new tab. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and a couple things I can do from this. I know that the URL for this is we're inside of our shared documents library, which is in the URL, shows it's in documents. And then I'm in a subfolder called teams or called general. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this URL, come back over here to my project and just in a scratch place, put that in. I know that, let's grab the rest of the URL so we can look, I can show you this, the different pieces that you're going to want. And let's wrap it up. Okay. So here we can see that in the root folder, I'm inside of the shared documents, and then I can see I'm inside of a folder called general. So I'm going to grab the general folder right there, put that right here, and then I need to put the actual file name that we are requesting, which is docx. So I'm going to say document.docx. I know we're going to have two of these because we're going to have a workbook.xlsx. Now another thing we need is I need to get the ID. I'm going to need to get the ID of this item. So the way you can do that, well, I got this first part of the URL. Let's come back over here to our to the browser here, and if I go open this item, actually you can get a little more info from this if you grab this URL. So here we can see there's the name of the file right there. So we can see the name of the file where it says file equals. But then, so in addition to the document, I need to get the source ID. So I know that it's going to be delimited by these curly brackets, but they're going to be also URL encoded. So I can see the %7D and %7B. I know that those two are not the actual ID for the document. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that ID out. That's the ID for our document. And then we also need to get the ID for our spreadsheet. And that is right here. Great, so we have both those values. Okay, so we're gonna need those in just a minute. Now, let's go back and let's update our tab to go add in a Word tab. So I'm gonna start by going through and adding in a button control. We're gonna need that, so I'm gonna say button. And then after I add my button control, I also am gonna go ahead and import two icons to indicate we have a Word and an Excel file. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do an import statement. And this is going to be from Fluent UI React North Star, but it's React Icons North Star. And I know the two icons I want are the Word icon and the Excel icon. We're going to use both of those pictures. All right, now the next thing we want to do is I want to go add in two handlers. One for when I click a button for adding a Word tab, one for adding a button, one for the handler for when I click the Excel button. Now I'm going to put both of these handlers, I'm going to put them right before, let's see, my render method right here. And this is a lot of code. So let's just take a second and let's actually explore what these things do. So I have one for Excel. Let's go ahead and hide that. And I have one for Word that you see right here. So let me explain what's going on here. In this code. I'm going to walk through this in a little bit of depth here. I didn't want to type this out and make sure I didn't get it right. So let's go through and let's take a look at this. So what I'm doing is that when this method runs, I'm going to create a reference to an endpoint. So I'm going to point to the team's endpoint for the current team, and I'm going to get that by getting his group ID. And then I also need to get the current channel ID as well. And then go all the way down to the tab's endpoint. I'm going to issue an HTTP post. It's going to say the content that I'm sending it is application JSON. I'm going to be authenticated with the graph access token. And then what I'm doing is I need to go in the body, I need to pass in a JSON object. Now the JSON object I'm passing in, as we talked about in the slides, I'm going to have to set a couple values here. I can set the Teams app, and then I also can set the configuration. So the Teams app, this is the one that I use for Microsoft Word, just like we saw in the slides. For the configuration, I need to go through and make sure these values match my current document. So I'm going to come over here and grab my document, document X, or docx. So I'll paste that in here. And then I also need to get the GUID for my document. All right, paste that in. This tab is gonna say Word, and then a little bit farther down, this is where I'm gonna submit it. So I'm gonna submit it to using the fetch API that we saw earlier. And I'm not gonna do anything to show that it worked because we're just gonna see the tab show up. I do the exact same thing with Excel. So I need to go update those two values for my Excel file, or for the Excel tab. And then I need to do the same thing for the GUID. Save my changes. We can get rid of all this. Come back to our tab. Okay, now that that's done, the next thing I have to do is I need to go in and add in my two buttons. So let's come over here to join teams, and let's add in a button. And our first button, his icon is going to be the Word icon. And his content is going to say Word, add a Word tab. And then the on-click handler for this is going to be set to this handle Word, no, that's Excel, handle Word click. All right. And we'll save our changes. I'll duplicate this line because we're going to do the same thing for Excel. Great. And we'll now save our changes. So now the last thing to do, test it. So let's come back over to our console and let's spin up the API in the web server. Make sure that ngrok is still running in the background, which it is. So API server is running, the web server is spinning up. All right. Word icon is defined but never used. It actually is used, so I'm not worried about that. We are using it, Word icon. Yeah, so it's just using it in a string. That's why it's not seeing it. Actually, I shouldn't have put those in a string now that I think about it. Let's take that out. Save the changes. It's going to rebuild it so I don't get the error. Okay, now we're good. All right, so now let's go back to our tab. So I'm going to go back to my tab. We should. All right, now we can see our tab is loaded. There's our Word tab and our Excel tab. So I'll select Add Word tab, and we'll just wait for it to show up. This can take a moment. There we go. We can see two more tabs. There's the Word tab that just showed up. And I'll go ahead and also select Excel tab to get the Excel tab to get created as well. And then we'll go take a look at both of those. So we're a little limited on our real estate here. We can see it all show up. If I open this up a little bit, there we go. There's our Word and Excel tabs. I select Word, and it will open up our Word tab and automatically load our document here, our document.x. And then here, our Excel file, it's going to open up our workbook file as well that we specified. Right? So pretty cool. So now you're able to see how we can go about using Microsoft Graph to create tabs, and also how we can create and configure some of the built-in out-of-the-box tabs in Microsoft Teams. The Microsoft Teams activity feed is going to enable users to see a list of relevant items specific to that user. And users can use the activity feed to address changes, notifications, and other alerts in a very productive manner. So what we're going to look at in this unit is how you can use a Microsoft Graph to post to an activity feed. And there are a few things we're going to look at. We're going to look at understanding the basics of an activity feed notification, the requirements for sending activity feed notifications, and then how to do it. So let's look at what the activity feed is first. So this slide is kind of showing us what the experience looks like if I'm logged in as someone named Alex Wilbur. So this is kind of showing you two experiences. There's another user that's signed in somewhere else named Megan Bowen. And then in this case here, we're signed in as Alex Wilbur. So What has happened is in the background is that Megan has done something that has triggered an activity notification that has submitted an activity notification message to Albert or to Alex. You can see in the screenshot on the right that we have the notification in the bottom right corner that it says that Megan has added a word tab to the test team's general channel. And then over here on the up in the top left in the navigation bar, you can see the activity feed has one unread message. And if I select it on the left-hand side, you can see that there's the full context of that activity message. And that can even have a URL tied to it. So if I click on it, it would take me to whatever I had defined inside of my application. So let's look at the basics of an activity feed notification. Activity feed notifications in Microsoft Teams are composed of a bunch of different bits of information that when they're displayed together, they look like what you see here on this slide. So a notification object contains the following components that you see here on this slide. You've got the actor that started the activity that's over there on the left, as well as their avatar. You've got an icon that represents the activity type. You've got a reason that the actor did the activity, a text preview, a timestamp, and the location of the activity as well. Now in this case here, there's nothing listed, but you can see actually that there's a little that would it actually say the team name and the channel name of where this actually happened. Now the activity feed notifications, these are used to inform a user of something in Microsoft Teams apps that are installed for users in Teams and group chats. These are a way for us to provide that notification information based on 3 different contexts for my app. So these 3 contexts that I can actually send a notification to a user are to notify a user in a team, and notify a user within a chat. All right, so these are the 3 different ways, 3 different contexts that I can use this activity feed and these notifications for. And there's a couple requirements for sending activity feed notifications. So we must meet the following requirements. First, for a user to receive a notification, the custom Teams app must be installed for the recipient of the notification. Now this can be done by the recipient themselves, such as in the case of a personal app, or in a team or a group chat that they're associated with. The second one is that the custom Microsoft Teams app must be associated with an Azure AD application. And then the third requirement is that a notification activity types that are supported by your application must be defined in the application's manifest file. So the first requirement, that's pretty self-explanatory. So let's look at the other 2 requirements in a little more depth. So again, the first requirement is to associate the Microsoft Teams app with the Azure AD app that was created the actual app. The Azure AD app is used to define the permissions and ensure that the app and the user has gone through the consent process prior to sending the notifications. Now, this association is defined inside of the Microsoft Teams app manifest file, and you can see that here. Now, I've cut out a lot of the stuff, but usually towards the bottom of the manifest, you have this web application info, and that is pointing to an Azure AD app that is defined inside of Azure AD, right? So this is the thing that the users are going to have to end up consenting to. That ID property, that should be set to the Azure AD app's client ID, while the resource should be set to the Azure AD app's URI. And you'll see that when we create when we created an app inside of Azure AD. Now, the next requirement is to register with Microsoft Teams. And you have to register the types of activities that the app can send notifications about. The activity registration, like the Azure AD App Association, is done in the Microsoft Teams app manifest file. So the activity has a type property that must be unique in the app manifest, and this is how your API will send consistent notifications to your users. You've then got this template text property that contains a string that's going to be used to display the alert message. You can notice that this can be a parameterized string where your app can define parameters that should go into the activity type. The parameters are indicated with the little curly brackets or mustache brackets characters. Now, you do see one special parameter, the actor parameter, that is always inserted by Microsoft Teams, and it represents the name of the caller, which is either the user or the app that sent the activity feed notification. The activity feed notifications are sent to users with the Microsoft Graph's send activity notification endpoint using an HTTP post. The body of the HTTP request contains the details of the notification. Let's take the following example of an HTTP request payload. Now notice the topic object represents the subject of the notification. It is going to specify the resource that's being talked about in the notification itself. This can be an entity URL or it can be text. If you want to learn more about this, go check out the Microsoft Graph documentation for the teamwork activity resource type. Now the activity property must match one of the activities listed in the Microsoft Teams app manifest file. The preview text, that's going to contain the text for the notification. Now for that, only the first 150 characters are going to be shown in Microsoft Teams. The recipient, it contains a reference to the intended recipient of the notification message. So you can see there that I have an OData type that I have to specify, and the user ID is the GUID or the object ID of the user as they're listed inside of your Azure AD tenant. The last one is the template of parameters, and that is an array of name value pairs that Microsoft Teams will use to replace parameterized values in the activity feed as defined in the Microsoft Teams app manifest file. All right, so let's see how this works. So in this demo, we're going to see how to use the Microsoft Graph to submit notifications to the Microsoft Teams activity feed. All right, as you saw in the last demo that we did, the Microsoft Graph Teamwork endpoint supports modifying tabs in an existing channel. What I would like to do is that when the user that executes the code that calls the tabs endpoint, what I want them to be able to do is I want them to send a notification to all other users or to one specific user that the tab was actually created. Okay, so I want when I do the same demo effectively that I just did in the last demo, or this when I show the next demo, I want when that tab gets added, I want that to add a message inside of my activity feed that something just happened here. All right, that the tab was created. So to do that, I'm going to have to give my app more permissions. So just like last time, we're going to come over to my app inside of Azure AD. I'm going to add a new permission for it. And this new permission is a delegated permission for Teams activity send. So I want to send a message. So I'll say add permissions. And then again, we're going to simplify things by going ahead and granting consent to that permission. Now the activity feed notifications can't be sent from a user back to themselves. So for this specific demo, I'm going to need to sign into Teams in another browser session as a different user than the one that I've been using, because one of them is going to actually create the tab, and then that's going to trigger a notification to the other one. So while I'm inside of Azure AD, let's go find another user. So I'm going to go to my users tab, and I'm going to grab this user named Alex Wilbur. And the way that we're going to send a notification from one user to another one is by the unique ID of the user, which is their object ID. So I'm going to copy this value, and I'm going to go ahead and put that over here. Alex W is going to use this. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use this GUID. So we're going to need that in our code. Now, the next thing that I'm going to have to do is I need to go notify or let Microsoft Teams know that there is an activity that I want to be able to send. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over to the Teams app manifest here, this manifest JSON, and I'm going to add in a new element right after it. So this new element or this new property is going to be activities. And for the different activity types that can be defined here, I'm going to have a new object, and this new object, the type of it is going to be a user mention. The description for this is going to be a personal mention activity, and the template text is going to say actor. I'm going to use let's go add a comma there. This user is the one that added the whatever the name of the tab is, and we're going to have to specify that when we send the activity tab to the team names channel name channel. So that's the entire text that we're going to see show up in the activity feed. However, we're going to replace some of these values. So go ahead and save my changes. And you can see here that it created a new app package, and it's also updating our app registration. But you're going to see we're going to do this a little bit differently in a minute. The app was actually automatically updated for us, but I'm going to show you how to also manually update it. All right, so now let's go modify our tab's code to actually send the activity. So we're going to do this for our Word when we add a Word tab. So not the Excel tab. Let's come down here into our Word tab. And inside this if statement, I'm going to add in an else after this is the response okay. This is kind of our error condition. So when there's no error, I'm going to say else. I'm going to I'm going to redefine the endpoint to point to the HTTPS graph.microsoft.com/beta teams. And I want the this.state, give myself more room, context, the group ID. And I want this to send to the send activity notification. Now, what are we going to send it? Well, that's the endpoint we're going to, but I'm going to go ahead and paste in some code here to kind of simplify things. So I just pasted in all of this code that I have highlighted right here. So what are we doing? Well, I have to define some parameters for my request that's going to be sent to the graph endpoint. So it's going to be an HTTPS post method that's going to be sent. I'm sending in a JSON object, and I'm going to authenticate using the graph access token. For the body, I'm going to send it a JSON object, which I'm going to wrap up in the JSON stringify method. The object I'm going to send it is first a topic. So the topic I'm going to be sending it is the source URL. The source of it is an entity URL, and I'm going to send across the value of the endpoint. So the topic, the entity URL I'm sending it to is this specific team. Next, the activity type is a user mention. So we talked about the differences with this in the slides. This activity type has to match the type that we previously registered in the manifest.json. The next part is the recipient. That contains the object ID of Alex Wilbur. So we'll double check on this. It's a 97C431, 97C431. Okay, so we're going to assume that the rest of that is correct. And then that's the one that's the user that should get the notification. So in a real world application, I'm probably going to want to look up that object ID to make sure I send it to the person that I intend to, because I'm going to make it a little bit more dynamic. The last one is the template parameters. The template parameters array contains a match, contains all the objects that match the template strings that we specified in the template text that was inside of that manifest file. So we had actors, and we also had, or actor, and then we also had tab name, team name, and channel name. For all three of these are the custom ones. Actor is the one that's sent to everyone. So to see this work, I'll go ahead and save my changes. And I'm going to come back over here to the code or to our console, and we're going to go ahead and spin these two up. Now, while that's spinning up, let's come over here to Microsoft Teams. And what I'm going to do, you can ignore this because we shut down our web server. That's why our tab died. But it's spinning back up, so it'll be just fine in just a minute. So what I want to do is I'm going to come back over here to where I actually installed our app, where I was previously working with our installed app. And so I'm going to come over here to our apps, and we can see our Playground tab is listed right here. All right, there's our MS Graph Playground tab. What I want to do is, while the Teams Toolkit already registered this, and it should have already updated as well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how, if you had to do this manually, I'm going to show you how to go about doing it. It's the same, it's going to have the same net effect, but it's something that it's nice that you should be aware of. Now, I'm just going to upload the exact same manifest on top of our app to this team. And what that's going to do is that's going to overwrite what's already there. All right, so there we go. We just did it again. It's the exact same thing. Now let's go ahead and let's test our activity feed. Now, again, an activity feed notification can't be sent from one user to themselves. So for this one, I need to sign in another browser session. So we'll go ahead and add in yet another browser session. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to launch a totally different browser this time. So we'll come over here and we'll add in a new browser. So we're using Edge and Chrome. So I'll put Chrome over, or Edge over here and Chrome over here. All right, so I'm gone ahead and I've logged in as Alex. And a couple things I want you to notice here, right? So Alex has access to our test team and he can see these tabs here. So one of the things I'm going to do is I want to come over here and let's get rid of our Word tab because we're going to want to add a new one. So I'm going to come over here and remove that tab, and it will disappear from Alex's experience as well. So now we just have Excel. Okay, so what I want you to notice is that when I go in and I'm going to come back to our tab over here as Megan. Let's see if I can make it so both of these show up. All right, now what I want you to notice, watch up here in the activity feed for Alex at the top and in his notifications section that would normally show up down over here in the section or in the bottom right of the team's experience. So I'm going to come over here and select Add a Word tab. It's going to be adding the tab, and then once that tab gets added, there we go. We can see we got the notification that popped up over here. And if I clicked on this, or if I just went to Alex's activity feed, I can select it and I can see, oh look, we can see that this is that Megan sent this notification that showed up right here. So I've done this exact same one to test it a few other times. We can see it showing up in the past, but this is the one that we just did just a second ago. All right. And so with that, you've seen how to register a new tab activity, or how to register an activity with your Microsoft Teams app, and then how to use the Microsoft Graph Teamwork endpoint to send a message using the activity feed inside of Microsoft Teams. Thank you for watching this module. I hope you got a lot out of this, and I hope you learned something. This screencast is has an associated module to go along with it. And that module includes not only slides and demos, but it also includes a hands-on lab that will walk you through all of the steps that we showed here in the demonstration sections of this screencast. So make sure you check out the notes for this video to get access to the module where you'll find more information that you can use to get more about these resources. Thank you very much.